Roguelikes continue to be one of the most popular genres right now. The god runs, high replayability, and wild, emergent gameplay makes roguelikes easy to get into as players and fun to design for developers. Throw in some meta progression and you get roguelites, also super fun and popular, and don't worry, I'll explain the differences later. But first, I want to ask these questions. What makes roguelikes so fun and popular? Are these games roguelikes? And why does it seem like AAA studios avoid them while indie developers love them? To answer these questions, we first have to look at what makes a game a roguelike. Welcome, my name is Alan, and on this channel I talk about game design and my own insights and lessons as an indie dev. Alright, definitions. I promise it's not as confusing as everyone makes it, so here it is. Going by Steam tags, which I find is the most consistent way people do this, you have traditional roguelikes, roguelikes, and roguelites. Traditional roguelikes are the easiest to get. There's a whole set of mechanics a game must have, but basically traditional roguelikes are games that play and look like the game Rogue. Almost every time you see someone mention roguelike online, they're not talking about these games, which is why Steam added the traditional roguelike tag. Roguelikes, on the other hand, checks most of these boxes but not all, most popular ones being permadeath, run-based gameplay, and random dungeons or levels. For the rest of the game, it can be almost any genre, like action, turn-based, co-op, etc. As long as it has the core mechanics I mentioned, people will label it as a roguelike. Finally, the main difference between roguelike and roguelite is the meta progression aspect. That means if doing a run grants another layer of progression that you keep outside of the run. Whether it's persistent levels, items, or skill points, then it's considered a roguelite. I think the distinction between roguelike and roguelite is starting to matter less and less, since most games in either genre will just add both of these tags. And I think there's a much bigger overlap between these two genres than with traditional roguelikes. And when it comes to online discussion, most people just use roguelike to mean both roguelike and roguelite. So in my opinion, I think the distinction between traditional roguelike and roguelikes is good enough. Alright, with that out of the way, I want to make it clear that the rest of the video will not focus on traditional roguelikes. Instead, I want to talk about what makes roguelikes fun, and the hidden rules or genre conventions that game designers have to follow, despite it being such a flexible recipe for gameplay. To figure out the genre expectations, or these hidden rules as I like to call them, I think the most effective way is just to play a bunch of games and see what people say about them. So that's what I did, and I gathered these 4 hidden rules. The first is you must have lots of run variety. I think the bullet heaven genre like Vampire Survivors and Brotato really do this well. Brotato does this by creating a wide cast of starting characters, each with their own exaggerated strengths and weaknesses. You really want a wild stat spread and unique starting abilities that make each character feel special. Another thing they do is create abilities and effects that are heavily randomized and vastly different from each other. When I'm playing these games, I'm always building on top of synergies between upgrades I find, and I might go into a run expecting to build my character one way, but end up with a completely different build because I found something else. When you don't have great run variety, these games can get tiring very fast because of their extremely simple gameplay and narrative. Next, the game needs to have skill expression. This is especially important for action-based roguelikes to shine. Hades and Dead Cells are great examples of this, so are games with room-to-room combat and bosses in between. With these games, skill expression comes in 2 flavors. One is more obvious, the other is more subtle. And if both are great, it really elevates an action roguelike. First, you have the mechanical raw skill expression of just moving, attacking, and dodging better. A player will naturally get better at doing this run after run, and it's a great feeling when you have mastered the boss's attack patterns to outplay it. The other more subtle way of building skill expression is by designing upgrades and effects that interact in clever and game-changing ways. A player can get better at picking combos that work together or effects that they're good at using, which makes replaying the game more fun and interesting. The key here is to balance the two and allow room for both types of skill expression to shine. This is where the room-to-room combat structure and mandatory bosses come in. The bosses act as a standardized challenge the players can measure up against, and you can imagine how boring it would be if every upgrade just gave generic stat increases and the combat is very one-dimensional with no interactions with the boss. The third hidden rule is something I think older gamers will appreciate, and it's the low energy commitment required to play roguelikes. What I mean is that popular roguelikes tend to lean into a setting with lower emotional stakes and put you into the gameplay right away. After a hard day of work, you might be more willing to boot up a fun and cozy roguelike to play for an hour or two, compared to a highly cinematic behemoth of an RPG. I like to compare it to watching sitcoms versus watching like an artsy 3-hour long film. Keeping with that analogy, the duration and accessibility matters too. That's why I think card or turn-based games like Balatro and Slay the Spire are excellent at leading into this low commitment vibe. By having runs that last between 10 to 30 minutes and making it easy for you to pause and do something else during each round. As much as I enjoy games like Witcher 3 and God of War Ragnarok, these silly little roguelikes are what I play most often for unwinding. A full-blown RPG, while very immersive, might take like 10 hours to get fully invested, compared to a roguelike with fun gameplay that starts right away. The final hidden rule is to make sure the player wants to play again. This happens in any number of ways, but my personal favorites are things like meta progression and harder challenges. Roguelikes with a clear goal and strong strategic element tend to do this well. Having a reliable and noticeable meta progression system makes it more motivating for players to try again after they lose, since a run isn't wasted if they gained permanent power from it. And it also makes the challenge much more approachable, knowing that you can be stronger with some investment. Darkest Dungeon 2 uses this in a very effective way, with abilities that are unlocked permanently and access to starting items by spending currency you gain each run. On the other hand, for players that already beat the game, having harder challenges to opt into is a great way to nudge the players into giving it another go. DD2 features multiple challenge modes that you can pick from that encourage you to try different strategies. Okay, so these genre conventions or hidden rules are actually super flexible and attainable, and that might explain why so many games package their gameplay into the roguelike format. So why wouldn't you make any game into a roguelike, and why do AAA games rarely make them? Luckily, Nightreign just came out and we can look at it to see why. To really showcase the trade-offs for making a roguelike, we can look at base Elden Ring versus Elden Ring Nightreign. Let's look at how the core gameplay loop has changed here, and why some fans of roguelikes were kind of disappointed by Nightreign. Oh, and by the way, I'm not saying Nightreign is bad at all here, I'm actually having a ton of fun with it. I just think this is a perfect example because we actually have the official roguelike version versus the original to compare against. So very briefly, for those who have never played these games, the core gameplay loop for Elden Ring can be boiled down to this. Explore a wide open world, defeat small enemies and clear dungeons, level up and customize your build, and take on large powerful bosses to unlock the next area. In Nightreign, the core gameplay loop remains mostly the same, but with adjustments made from the roguelike structure. Mainly, the map is way smaller, and your character is locked into specific RPG classes with their own unique skills. You're still doing all the same things, just condensed into 2 15-minute rounds plus a final boss, and your character is reset after each match. So let's take a look at the first criticism, which is the randomness introduced to the game and how some runs feel doomed from the start because of it. In Nightreign, this can happen when you don't find a good weapon that the boss is weak against, or you might run into encounters and events that are hard to clear, making you even weaker. In both of these cases, it feels extra bad because you're put at a disadvantage simply from getting unlucky. Of course, there are ways to overcome these, but these cursed runs are generally expected as things that just happen in roguelikes, especially when you're still new to the game. These next two criticisms I want to talk about feed into each other, and that is not having an interesting meta progression combo with a final boss that takes too long to retry. Let me explain. From my experience, roguelikes are typically balanced so that an experienced player can finish a run at a moderate power level, assuming they're making reasonable choices and engaging with tools of the game. So for a new player that doesn't know how these mechanics work, the first boss they encounter will typically roll over them. But in base Elden Ring, you can typically run back to the boss within 30 seconds and try again at the same power level. Meanwhile, character power is reset in Nightreign, and it takes about 35 minutes to get to the final boss again. It can feel very demotivating if there's no meta progression to bail players out. A large part of why I enjoy meta progression in run-based games is that even when I fail a run, I still feel like I'm making progress. Most players need or expect a guaranteed source of progression to remain engaged if the game is challenging, which roguelikes and Souls games typically are. Okay, so there are trade-offs for making a game into a roguelike. But here's an interesting thing I noticed, is that these issues can all be fixed, not entirely, but mostly fixed with balance changes. People were quick to label Nightreign as a flop because of the roguelike elements, but after some balance changes and learning ways to deal with bad RNG, it's genuinely one of my favorite games right now. I think this shows that while roguelikes might need extra playtests and balancing, it really is still all about the core gameplay loop. For an open world action game with a similar format to Elden Ring, Players will tolerate some janky or unfair mechanics if you have good story and interesting aesthetics, but this is definitely not the case with roguelikes. This is a big part of why I think AAA games shy away from this genre and why indie developers thrive here. They're more accessible as a developer, but you also run a higher risk of having the game be so reliant on the actual gameplay. For indie devs like me, this is a trade-off that's super worth it. Not to mention the randomness of roguelikes makes it much more engaging for myself to playtest and balance. And the assets I make can be reused in multiple interesting ways. For roguelikes, it's reasonable to spend a week to work on some enemies and upgrades that can result in hours of replay value. Whereas for AAA style games, you might spend a whole week to only create minutes of content and environments that can't even be reused. For these reasons, I think roguelikes will continue to be a popular, accessible choice for indies. In fact, I actually think it's a much more viable genre for success compared to other indie genres like Metrovanias and platformers. Its flexibility makes it easy to combine with other genres, and the things that make it enjoyable are fundamentally things that most players find fun about video games. By the way, I'm making a monster taming roguelike called Silvern Moonrise. It's a gothic turn-based RPG with a strong emphasis on creating your own abilities and capturing monsters to use as your servants in combat. If that sounds interesting to you, check it out on Steam using the link in the description and consider adding it to your wishlist. Thanks for watching, bye!